Mayor Biss, hello. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. As we sit here today, it is Thursday, February 25th. We are 33 days out from Election Day, 18 days out from early voting starting. How's it feeling? What are you up to on the campaign trail, and what's the activity like at Team Biss?
It is frenetic and exciting. I'm working really, really hard, trying to earn every vote, trying to really put in front of people not only information about what we've done and what our plans are, but also give folks a chance to weigh in and share their thoughts. And I'm out knocking on doors in every corner of the community. I'm rushing from here to do an event in a private home, and just want to make sure that anybody who's got questions or is trying to make up their mind has access to me and a chance to have nice conversations.
So as you're out talking to voters, knocking on doors, what are the major themes and questions that are coming up, whether it's about the city at large or about you as a candidate?
Let's be real here. It's a tough time. It's a tough time in the world. It's a very tough time in the country. This new administration is terrifying all of us. And I think that is coloring the tone that's out there. I think people are relieved to see that Evanston is standing up as a bulwark, but they also want to make sure that we're doing it right, that on the big things that we're working on, whether it's Envision Evanston and our housing plans, whether it's our healthy buildings ordinance and our climate efforts, whether it's making sure city services are delivered properly or that we're straightening out our budget, people are looking around at government failing elsewhere, and they want to make sure we're getting it right. And I really appreciate that engagement. It's why this job is exciting. It's what makes being mayor of Evanston different than being mayor of some other neighboring community.
So getting right into the policy stuff, you mentioned Envision Evanston. The revised draft of the new comp plan came out on Friday, and as of last night, Land Use Commission made official that they will not be expecting or taking any final action on the plan in time for the April 1st election. So the plan itself will be a matter for the next council to consider. So the last time you and I spoke about Envision Evanston, you had a statement that has caused a bit of a stir in the month or two since then about the value and urgency and of the timeline of the entire project. Wanted to give you an opportunity. Do you have any updates or just like new context to share on that, or just responding to the reaction from the community to the statement from our interview back in December?
Well, I want to take every opportunity I get to apologize for a really poor choice of words. And I think we've talked about it. I saw that headline and cringed, and I continue to feel bad about it. So I regret that choice of words. What I stand by is the sentiment that I failed to get across correctly. And that sentiment was very simple. This is important work. When we get it right, it does a lot for the community in the areas of affordability across income levels, environmental sustainability, economic revitalization, bringing our property tax burden down. It's work that will really only have a gradual effect. And so as beneficial as it is to achieve those upsides when we get it right, it's also going to take a lot of time. All of that lends a real sense of urgency. And therefore it is, in my opinion, a mistake to go less quickly than appropriate. At the same time, it doesn't make any sense to go too fast, because we got to do it right. We have to take the time required to get a good product, and we have to take the time required to get input from across the community, from all different constituencies, people in all different walks of life. And I think that's consistent with what I've said from the beginning. Even if you look back at my comments back in 2023 and early 2024 about the need to get everybody at the table in order to ensure that we do this right. And so I continue to believe that we need to do it properly. We need to take the time required to get everyone's input. And we also need to act with urgency, because affordable housing and sustainability and economic revitalization are important priorities that we can't sleep on.
Keeping that in mind, that the need to get everybody at the table and that needs to be what sets the timeline. At the same time, it does seem like your perspective on this from the dais has shifted over time. Back in January, you did speak supportively of decoupling the plan from the zoning code and then extending that out. And you've made clear that the Land Use Commission should take all the time they need, get all the materials they need before they take a final decision on it. What's been moving the needle for you over the last few months as far as understanding what that full timeline needs to look like?
Well, again, I think it's important to distinguish what needle has moved and what needle hasn't moved. So the needle that has not moved is, this is urgent. We should treat it with urgency. and it's critical to get it right, and we've got to take the time required to get it right. That's been throughout a hallmark of how I've been approaching this. What's changed is my assessment of how much time was required to get it right. And, again, part of the beauty of this community is people really want to be at the table. And what's become very clear is that notwithstanding the city's efforts, the 100+ public meetings we've had, the communications that I've put out by email that our staff and other council members have had, notwithstanding all that, people, found it hard to engage, understandably, until there was something concrete in paper to respond to. And so for many residents, the clock didn't really start when Daniel said, hey, this is an important issue. That's irrelevant to most people. The clock started for a lot of residents when a draft came out. And so now we've got to really take the time with that clock moving for people to really digest it, think about what they want, think about what they don't like, and give input. And so I think the timeline that we have in place now makes sense from that standpoint. And I think, again, moving forward as expeditiously as is responsible is a great thing to do. And if we find ourselves in the fall saying we need a little bit more time to get this right, we'll take that time then as well.
So speaking of something material to look at, the new revision of the plan is out. Have you had a chance to look at it, skim through it? Just a couple of hours before this interview, you sent out a message from the mayor. Have you had the time to read through and see the differences? What's your take on the revisions, and how do you think the process is going now?
I think it's going well, and I haven't had a chance to watch the entire Land Use Commission meeting from last night, but I think it's pretty clear that it was a less contentious and more positive discussion than had happened before. And I think part of that is that one of the key changes, and there are many improvements and a lot more information and a lot of additional stuff, but I think one of the key high-level changes in this current draft is it really respects clearly the idea that the comprehensive plan shouldn't itself kind of be a sort of proto-zoning code, that it really leaves for the future discussions about the zoning code, and understanding that there's a lot of different opinions and a lot of different conversations that have to happen on that front. And so by kind of leaving that to a later date, I think it allows us to focus on the other questions in the comprehensive plan, which I think are likely to be less tough and in some cases even less contentious for the community.
Gotcha. Do you feel like now it covers kind of the full breadth of scope that it should? There were new chapters that were added in. Like, have we reached the comprehensive part and we're kind of ironing out from there?
That's my take at this point. And I think it's important to have the Land Use Commission continue to have their conversations. I'm not going to try to get ahead of that or preempt that. But my sense is that, it's really a lot of the areas that made some people anxious because they appeared to be gaps have been filled in, and that there really is a lot of breadth to this document, reflecting the breadth of questions and priorities and challenges that folks have across Evanston.
So getting into more of the housing-specific side of things, a lot has already been said about the idea of supply and demand as the driver of housing costs, and the idea of bringing in more supply to help mitigate or lower, address demand and then mitigate and lower costs from there. You've made it clear you do support this approach for Evanston, at least as a part of the strategy, but it has been questioned about how much new housing stock would be needed for that desired effect. So I wanted to ask about, Evanston is a mature and largely built out community. And, part of this whole planning process has been acknowledging there's not much vacant land to work with. And, I guess what I'm getting at here is how do you see the balancing act between how much new housing stock would be needed to have that desired effect versus how much do you think would be appropriate to add in, whether it's concentrated in an area like downtown or spread out throughout? Where do we hit the sweet spot on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say that, there's been suggestions by CMAP and others that perhaps a population growth of about 8,000 is kind of a likely projection for the next few decades. To me, that planning for that kind of growth strikes me as both achieving enough change to make a real difference while also not fundamentally transforming what life feels like here, right? Growing our population by around 10% is meaningful, but it's not a total game changer in terms of, how crowded and congested things feel. So I think that's a good sort of general ballpark. And again, it's rooted in demographic projections by professionals, which I think is how we ought to be basing this. I also think, though, let's be really honest here. All of this requires constant monitoring and assessment. And if you look at other communities that have grappled with these questions, they've found that kind of in the early years, there's very modest change. Some of them have kind of gone back and tried to make bigger changes. It's also possible to rein things in if we feel like it's moving too quickly. I think part of what brings us to a challenging moment now is that our zoning code and comprehensive plan are way overdue for a fresh look. And so if we instead get in the habit of constantly assessing and thinking about what kind of modest tweaks to the zoning code would be beneficial given kind of both where we are and the trajectory we appear to be on, then we don't need to contemplate such big changes every 30, 40, 50 years.
So speaking of, talking about affordability and speaking here about like market affordability, not legally subsidized housing, but just making it attainable. Evanston's already a very highly desired and high housing cost market. And that growth is already happening year over year in the housing costs. Do you think it's a realistic goal to like nominally reduce like the number of dollars price, or is it more realistic to maybe just try to slow down the price increases or stabilize it? I'm thinking about Austin, Texas, where a building boom brought down rentals, but that's not going to happen here. There's no land to do the building boom with. So, what is ultimately the end goal with addressing the price, and what is realistic living in a neighborhood or a community rather that's already expensive?
Yeah, and I think Austin is an interesting example, but it's not that helpful an example. I think among other things, the kind of explosive growth that Austin has experienced in the last decade, let's say, is not, I think, what most people are looking for in Evanston. So I don't view it as that much of a model. I think there's two different things happening here, though, right? One is for like types of housing stock, what does a change in supply facilitate, right? So if you have, let's say, more two-bedroom apartments in the rental market next year than you have this year, then what effect does that have? And I think that effect is really likeliest to cause a leveling, not a nominal decrease. But the other question is, what happens as the housing stock mix changes, right? So if you begin to allow more duplexes, you may not bring down the average price of a duplex, but the average price of a duplex will still be much less than the average price of a single family home. And so you're changing the mix of for what types of households there's more availability of affordable units. And I think that second category is really important to consider as well.
Gotcha. So pulling out back to broader policy, you were running for reelection, so you came in, for your first term with a policy agenda, with a slate. How do you feel that what you ran on 4 years ago has been effectuated over the last 4 years? You ran on zoning reform, which obviously that's still a work in progress, but everything else, how's it gone?
To tell you, I'm proud of what we accomplished. When I think back to the issues that were really the pillars of the campaign, we talked so much about public safety. And I'm really proud of how we handled that, which was, it was very much the kind of issue of the moment back then, and it's moved away from the front pages. But we've taken a slow but steady approach. Didn't do anything kind of knee-jerk, didn't follow some communities that overshot the mark and had to rein things back, but studied, thought, planned, rolled out the CARE team, an alternate emergency response group that I think is making a really significant impact, created the living room of a facility just next to St. Francis Hospital that allows for peer support and de-escalation and a place for individuals experiencing mental health crisis to go rather than an emergency room or even a police station to receive support and case management. Made changes to how traffic stops were approached to both focus police resources on the forms of traffic enforcement that are most connected to safety while also really shifting away from those that have the greatest racial disparity. So I'm proud of our successes there. I recognize that there's plenty of unfinished work in the housing area, but we've made important progress, whether that's the development of Lot 1 into affordable housing, which is really moving forward now at long last, whether it's the strengthening of the inclusionary housing ordinance, whether it's the deal with Northwestern that brought eight-figure number of dollars into our affordable housing fund. So I think we're making progress on that front too. We've made important progress on sustainability already, and I would say the capstone of the first term agenda there would be the Healthy Buildings Ordinance, which I hope passes shortly. But even before that, we've made a lot of progress. So I think we've done a tremendous amount. But I look around at this town and I know there's a lot more to do. That's why I'm running. There's so much left to do, not only on these big areas of campaign promises from 4 years ago, but also just making sure that our government is financially sustainable, that we're adequately inclusive and responsive, and designing a public sector that's really built around the needs of Evanston residents.
So your political background was originally in Springfield and state politics, and coming into the mayoral race and campaigning on that in 2021. From then to now, I guess, what have you learned about the differences between how things work in Springfield versus how things work in Evanston, and how is your approach shifted now? If you were to win going into a second term.
Yeah, it's been such a learning experience and such a growing experience. The delight about local government is that people are at the table, right? And with Springfield, people would kind of say, "Listen, Daniel, go to Springfield. Good luck. Come back in a couple of years and tell us how it went." And we may not pay attention then too. And here, really, people's ask is, we want to be at the table to solve the problems together, and that's just a delightful thrill to be able to work collaboratively with community on these issues. In Springfield, and when I was in the House, I had to count to 60, and when I was in the Senate, I had to count to 30 to get a majority, and in the City Council, I got to count to 5, and it's somehow harder. You have even in this little town, you have such diversity on the council, diversity among the neighborhoods. And by virtue of only having 9 people, everybody really feels a deep, intense stake and wants to put their stamp on every issue. And so finding ways to partner, to respect the very significant differences between people, but also to navigate those differences in a collaborative way that respects a diversity of opinion has been again, a thrill, but it's been a growing process. And I'm proud of how much I've evolved in my ability to manage those challenges, and excited about bringing that learning to another 4 years.
So outside of the projects that are already in progress, Envision, HBO, coming in day one, I guess May 12th, what would be, if any, like new initiatives or new projects that haven't necessarily started yet or just kind of in the background that would be your priorities for a new term?
Well, these are things that are not yet really underway, but they're not news to you. The Putting Assets to Work project, to make sure that we're making the best use of municipal assets and making wise choices about the location of City Hall and police and fire headquarters that are both financially sound, but also optimize our policy objectives. That's a really important thing. The development of the strategic housing plan is critical, right? We talk about the concern that all of us have about displacement in Evanston. The strategic housing plan is going to be the linchpin of an anti-displacement strategy going forward. I know this is a little not the most exciting topic in the world, but I've learned a lot these 4 years about what is and what's not working in terms of our municipal governance. And I think about things like the city council rules, mechanisms by which the city council can itself be a more smooth and collaborative entity, ways that city boards and commissions can be streamlined and better integrated into the policymaking process. I feel like 4 years is about what it takes to really see in detail kind of why things are how they are, and how they might be structured differently. And I think there's a lot of progress we can make there.
And as mayor, you do occupy a unique position with regards to that. As the chair parliamentarian of city council, you are overseeing and managing. You've described it as, I think, air traffic control at times. You've also talked about how at times this term, this council has, fallen into some dysfunction, and sometimes there are back and forths on the dais. As a recency bias kind of example, this most recent one, there was a brief dispute over time limits that ended with that. How do you navigate, managing that kind of conversation and that kind of back and forth that can happen on the dais, and then not only in your role as chair, but then as somebody who's also not a voter, but a legislator nonetheless, in putting your own policy proposals forward? Like, how have you learned to manage with a light touch, heavy touch? What's your approach?
Well, there's 2 ironclad principles that are in tension with each other. One is I am deeply respectful of the autonomy and independence of every council member. I don't have to like what they're saying. I don't even have to like how they're saying it. A lot of the feedback I get is like, why did you let that motion happen? And the answer is that motion was in order. And I'm not there to referee whether I like the motion. I'm there to referee whether the motion is in order. So respecting everyone's autonomy, respecting that they're going to represent their own wards in different ways. And my job is not to get in the way of that, but to facilitate that is one fundamental principle. The other fundamental principle is to facilitate discourse, which is in bounds always, and civil and respectful and productive whenever possible. And so I have certainly, as you noticed, sometimes just literally cut people off, said, stop, you're not going to talk to each other that way. Let's approach it in a different way. But I most often try to approach that by modeling. I try really hard to model a form of discourse which is respectful of differences, tries to take seriously opinions that are not mine. I try to poke fun at myself but not others, and try to just approach the whole thing with a lot of respect for the people in the institution, but not taking myself too seriously.
The city does have a council manager form, and so you certainly aren't the boss of staff, but you do work frequently with staff and talk back and forth with that. And it does seem that at times, and for certain members of city council or the public, there is I might call it a suspicion or a hesitancy to trust some reports from staff or information that some people may find inconvenient, but instead of disagreeing with it, casting doubt on the legitimacy of it.
Yeah.
How do you approach managing the relationship between staff and the public as well as the rest of the dais? And how do you think that relationship should be, uh, improved, or I guess, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a problem. I appreciate the question, Alex. I'll just start by saying I respect our form of government. I'm not the CEO of the city. Luke Stowe, the city manager, is. I don't hire, I don't fire, I don't discipline. If I have concern about staff performance, which happens periodically, of course, I talk to Luke. And if I'm happy to be a sounding board with him about how to address it, or sometimes he just goes off and addresses it without even me being a sounding board of how. But I think respecting that form of government is really, really important. It is totally appropriate and productive to ask staff tough questions. It's totally appropriate and productive to say, you've offered me 3 options and I don't really love them. Can you come back with a different option? And we have a staff of 800 people, and I'm proud of them and they're excellent, but some of the work is better than other parts of the work. And it's appropriate to expect accountability when aspects of the work aren't up to standard. But I've never seen anything unethical on the part of our staff. I've never seen anything dishonest on the part of our staff. I've never seen anything misleading on the part of our staff. And often there's some reactions to information that some folks may not like by saying, I bet you're hiding the ball, or I don't really trust you, or I don't really believe it. Like, for example, my fellow candidate's questionnaire for the RoundTable said, to your very fair question of what are you going to do about the structural deficit, said, I'm not really sure there is one. Well, you're just living in a fantasy world at that point. You're either accusing our staff of dishonesty, or you're accusing them of some kind of monumental incompetence. And that just doesn't seem realistic. I think when we are confronted with tough facts, like a fact about how much it costs to renovate the Civic Center, how much of a structural deficit we have, we need to come to grips with those rather than attack the messenger. Because not only does attacking the messenger stop us from solving the problem, it also stops good people from wanting to work for the city of Evanston. And I think we shouldn't have elected officials, whether it's a mayor or council members, whose conduct in public makes it harder for us to recruit the excellent staff that our residents expect.
So pulling back to even further to, I guess, motivations, what brought you here in the first place, I asked you about your experience with the state legislature, but thinking about, going up to your run for governor, and then after that point, what did bring you to the municipal side? You talked about what you've learned along the way from shifting in that way, but why do that shift in the first place?
you know, in the moment that I decided to run for governor in I forget, summer or fall of 2020, not governor, mayor. Um, Not only were we in the throes of a pandemic, which was such a severe problem that I think required a robust and smart and well-managed public sector response, but the murder of George Floyd had happened a few months before. We were in the midst of nationwide protest around questions of race and policing, and there was already then a nationwide discussion about the connection between affordability, racial integration, and zoning. And so it just felt to me like these decisions that were so pivotal, these questions that we were wrestling with as a society that really were going to determine the trajectory of how our communities were run and how we were able to live our lives, were going to be decided at the local level. And that just felt like such an extraordinary opportunity to do good and make a difference by jumping into municipal government. And that's why I chose to run. And I think that I've served in that spirit. Again, as I said earlier, sure, the national attention to public safety reform might have shifted, but my attention didn't shift. And we've made transformational changes that have made Evanstonians safer, that have made our method for providing for public safety more racially just and fair, and have elevated morale in the police department and improved relationships between police and community. We're working through these tough issues around zoning, and I know that they're hard and the conversations are complicated, but we're doing it because the question we're asking is, how can communities like Evanston, progressive, diverse, desirable communities, become affordable for a broader and more diverse mix of people? I think these are just critical questions for us to grapple with as a society, and I feel unbelievably honored, but also humbled by the weight of them to have a chance to lead our community as we work through these questions.
Now, I want to bring up something that others have suggested about your positionality and the decision to come to the municipal side. Coming out of running for governor, some people, including your opponent, at times have asserted or claimed that this is a stepping stone of sorts, that there's some higher office or higher thing that you're actually angling for. Do you have a direct response for that? We've touched on this before, but wanted to offer that opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. My plan is to serve out this term. I've been elected to 4 terms in different offices. And of course, I've served out each one. If I'm lucky enough to stay in office until May 12th, I'll have served out all 4. But it's not just that I've served them. I feel like I've really given my all. I've leaned in. I've focused my full attention and my whole self on the job in front of me and the community that I live in and the community that I love. And I'm proud of that record of service. I mean, I find it actually astonishing, frankly, that particularly in this moment of all moments, the allegation about me seems to be, well, that guy has done too much government service. What we really ought to have is someone who doesn't do government service as mayor. I don't agree with that. And I respect completely that people might disagree with individual decisions I've made as mayor or as a state legislator, that people may have different positions than I do on issues, but I don't think anybody could look at my service and say anything other than, this guy is deeply committed to understanding government, figuring out how to use it as a tool to make change, and then delivering with it on behalf of the people that he's working for. And I think we need more of that in office now, not less.
And do you think that this, there is a tension at times in Evanston between, like, you kind of got at this, like what the people in office or what the suits will say, that other, versus like the true, like, resident, like, down in the ground perspective? Like, how do you bring those two sides together? Like, what often is discussed in city council, I say this as a journalist covering it, is very wonky, it can be detached from what people's day-to-day reality looks like. How do you show that value? How would you try to show people the value in having that experience as opposed to, like, regular old person? And I know that I'm kind of asking you to contrast yourself perhaps with your opponent, but genuinely on your own standing.
I think Elon Musk is doing a good job right now of showing what the value of having people who know something about government running government is. I think Bruce Rauner did a good job of showing that as well when he was governor of Illinois. I think that we sometimes make a mistake in this town of saying the community as though there's a monolith somewhere that has a particular simple point of view, and if only we just listened to them, everything would be easy. When in fact, our community is beautifully, gorgeously, phenomenally diverse. And not only is it racially and economically diverse and diverse in terms of walks of life people come from, but it's diverse in opinions, it's diverse in ideas, it's diverse in the ways people think about things. I think the job of a mayor is to be out among everybody and hear that full range of diversity and include the people, not only the people for whom some of the city council conversations may be a little bit wonky, but the people who never thought to pay attention to a city council conversation. I feel like, and it's often, you often hear politicians say, well, I work for everyone, whether you voted for me or against me. I work for the people who didn't vote at all, too. I work for the people who aren't old enough to vote. I work for the people who aren't citizens and aren't eligible to vote. And I think we need to have public officials who take seriously every opinion, who accept the legitimacy of every opinion, and also accept the complexity of this town and govern for complexity, not a kind of false oversimplification.
So the city is in, as all cities have been for the last 5 years, a very unique financial situation. You came into office on this where the COVID-19 pandemic really upended how the city finances were working for a short time. And then, following that, an infusion of federal aid funds really helped keep things going. And again, this was discussed in the last budget cycle, but not distorted, but just gave a different picture than maybe what can be expected going forward. That has ended. The federal aid has kind of been tapped out. And as you mentioned, there is now a federal government and administration that seems to be far more reticent to not only give out funds, new funds, but even disperse the funds that have already been given. What is, as mayor, your outlook on how finances need to be approached over the next 4 years, both because of those threats to the revenues that might have been expected before, and also the growing costs, especially capital costs, that the city is dealing with?
Well, I think you've got to start with realism, and I'll just say it again. I was very troubled to see my opponent question the basic black and white facts in audited financial statements, which is we do unfortunately have a structural deficit. I wish I could hope away inconvenient facts, but it's not a good way to get to a solution. A few basic things. We have to be focused on efficiency. One of the things that happened was the fiscal shock of the pandemic resulted in a big cut to city headcount, and since then we've kind of been building back, and that's been appropriate. It was appropriate to kind of rebuild some of the most severe hits to city headcount that happened, but now I think we need to change positions, as we already did really in the 2025 budget, of not only being very cautious about adding any headcount, but trying to figure out if there's ways to achieve efficiencies, ways to either through attrition or through merging to figure out how to have comparable city services with less cost. We have to be, in my opinion, very, very aggressive on watching the budget when it comes to these capital investments. I understand that having a phenomenal civic center would be great, but when I compare the civic center to other priorities like affordable housing, keeping property taxes down, sustainability, lead pipe replacement, maintaining our parks, what have you, I just come to the conclusion that those other items are more pressing. And so, I'm advocating for being extremely cost conscious when we make a long-term plan for the home of city government. And we have to be responsible. We have to be willing to raise the revenue needed to have a long-term balance in a budget that meets the needs and expectations of Evanston residents, but we also should try to be as smart as possible about how to raise that revenue because most of the revenue-raising tools in the municipal toolkit are pretty regressive. Obviously, the simplest one is the property tax, and not only is that not particularly correlated with the ability to pay, but it really raises the cost of housing in a moment when we're talking about a affordability crisis. And of course, let's not forget that the District 65 is experiencing significant challenges, and it's the same property taxpayers there. And so we need to be very conscious there of finding creative other ways to bring in revenue, whether that's from people who are coming into town from other communities, whether that's from kind of creative progressive ideas to bring in revenue. But we've got to be both honest about the revenue needs and really judicious about where it comes from.
Yeah, and the capital costs are what they are. They're being addressed now, at least in formulation. But
Well, I mean, respectfully, we're at least for the Civic Center, we're going to have a number of different options, and
Right,
they're going to
that's
have different types of cost structures, and so it's not like there's just some price tag someone's going to give us,
the
we got to
decision
pay it.
hasn't been made yet, but
And we don't know what it's going to. We don't know exactly what the decision will cost. Like for example, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
No, please,
but
please.
like
Yeah.
for example, you remember a few months ago now when there was talk about moving in with the library, there was a lot of enthusiasm on council. At a high level, that sounds great, right? That's a building that is known and I think beloved. It really is underutilized from a square footage standpoint right now, and you could have some real synergies by co-locating with the library. So that all sounds really great. We haven't had another in-depth conversation yet because the details aren't worked out, and we don't know what that renovation would cost. We don't know we don't know whether all municipal operations and all library operations truly could fit in that building, and if not, what else would be needed. So there's real question marks, and I don't believe that we have the information at this time to say, at the end of the day, the price tag will be X. I think there's still work to be done there.
Gotcha. So on the operations side, something that has been brought up by not only your opponent, but also others in the public is the idea of like, we could be spending less on, often it's a generality of we should be spending less, but from your position already being on the dais, like, are there, in your opinions, further opportunities for operational efficiencies that aren't already being used? And then parallel to that, are there services or programs of the city that you could see considering reducing or cutting in order to avoid revenue raising? Or is it like we don't want to hack an arm off for the sake of saving?
Well, I don't think we want to hack an arm off. I don't think there's big, I'm not going to say like, well, what if we didn't have the care team, right? Or, let's not have programming in the Parks and Rec department. I mean, these are, I don't think there's big categories that we want to just get rid of. I am not going to sit here and tell you that the city government is run as efficiently as it possibly could be. I think part of why it's really exciting to have brought in the 2 deputy city managers, still well under a year ago, is to have more capacity at that senior level of city management to really think strategically about how can we make the various departments more efficient. And by the way, to bring in 2 people, one from municipal government in this form of government, but from other states, and one from the city of Chicago, it's people who know government and know municipalities, but also have a different knowledge set that I think could be helpful. So I'm absolutely enthusiastic about the idea that we could find savings in the operation of municipal government. I mean, the fact that the 2025 budget had essentially 0 increase in non-personnel costs, I think that is effectively against inflation a savings and an indication that when the direction comes from the city manager, the departments have to figure out a way to provide comparable services at a modest decrease, that there's ways of doing it. So I'm very much on the market for continued efforts in that direction.
Mm-hmm. There's often a point that's brought up that for its size, relative with population, the city does have a large staff, a large headcount. You talked about hiring back over the last few years and that now kind of balancing off, but the city does have some unique aspects with its headcount. The water department is one example. There's a library within the city, Parks District. No Park District. Instead, it's a Parks and Rec department. Like, I guess, what would you want people to keep in mind when talking about, the large headcount as far as like what that actually means for what the city does? Like, how is Evanston different from, say, a neighbor like Skokie, which has a Park District
So most of our neighbors to the north and west have a separate government body, which is a park district, and a separate government body, which is a library district. So at a basic level, if you want to do apples to apples comparison, you would have to compare, let's say, the village of Skokie, the Skokie Park District, plus the Skokie Library to the city of Evanston. And then, as you say, yes, of course, the water department is a huge, complex organization that needs to be run extremely well. But it's actually not the end of the fact that we live on the lake adding to our headcount, whether that's the lakefront operation in the summertime or just the fact that it's kind of an additional complex place to manage. And so, I don't think that It's easy to find simple apples to apples comparisons. But again, that doesn't mean that we should just say, we are running the perfect government. There's no room for greater efficiency. There's no ways of doing things better. I think one of the benefits of these last few years is we've seen a lot of turnover at a senior level, not only Luke and the two deputies, but the community development and police and the law department and HR and others have all seen change. And a new set of eyes is always an opportunity to figure out ways of doing things better and ways of doing things less expensively. And I think we just need to always have both of those objectives in mind.
To wrap up, just as perhaps a bit of an easier question, if there is one thing that you want voters to know about you, remember about you, keep in mind as they are making a decision for who to elect mayor, what would it be?
Just one, huh?
If you can keep it.
I will follow your instructions to a T, though it will hurt a little bit. I have spent 12 years working my tail off to understand how to make government deliver for the people of this community, how to actually make change that is tactilely felt by people in Evanston. And in this moment of trouble, in this moment of threats coming from Washington, in this moment of turmoil here at home, I think those experiences and that knowledge and those skills are necessary to ensure that we continue moving forward and tackle the challenges and accept the mandate of, notwithstanding all the difficulty, still making progress, still going forward, still making tough choices, and still making this a place that people are so excited to flock to.
That's all. Thank you, Mayor Biss.
Thank you.